The handcuffs clicked shut in front of 40 witnesses, and not one of them knew they were watching a career end in real time. Natalie Carter stood at Pump 7 of the Riverside Gas Mart on the outskirts of Redstone City, a water bottle in one hand and her hospital badge in the other, while Captain Douglas Holt of the Redstone City Police Department told her, loudly and with absolute certainty, that she was a thief, a fraud, and probably a danger to the public. He said her credentials were fake. He said the SUV she was driving had to be stolen. He said people like her didn't own vehicles like this. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She looked at him and said very quietly, "You're making the biggest mistake of your career." Then she pressed 2 fingers against the inside of her left wrist, a gesture so small, so practiced that nobody saw it. And somewhere inside the Pentagon, a red light blinked on. If this story keeps you watching until the very last second, hit subscribe and drop a like. It means everything to me. And leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Ort. The morning had started. Most of Natalie Carter's mornings started, badly, quietly, and without anyone noticing. She'd been awake since 4:15, not because of an alarm, but because her body had never fully unlearned the habit of waking before dawn. Old muscle memory. She lay in the dark of her apartment for about 6 minutes, listening to the radiator knock against the baseboard and the distant sound of a truck downshifting on the highway 2 blocks over. And then she got up, made coffee she didn't have time to finish, and pulled on her scrubs. She was running 12 minutes late before she even got out the door. The Jeep Grand Meridian, dark gray, 2 years old, bought with her own money after 18 months of double shifts, sat in the parking structure on the 3rd level where she always left it. She loaded her bag into the back seat, adjusted the mirror out of habit, and pulled onto the interstate before the sun had fully cleared the eastern ridge. Redstone City sprawled out ahead of her in that particular early morning way, half-lit and uncertain, the kind of light that makes everything look temporary. She'd been working at Riverside Memorial Medical Center for 14 months, long enough to know which routes were fastest, which attending physicians to avoid before 8 a.m., and which of the overnight nurses left their patient notes in actual usable condition. Not long enough for anyone there to really know her. That was on most days exactly how she wanted it. She pulled off the interstate at exit 9 for fuel. The Riverside Gas Mart was a large station, 6 pump islands, a convenience store with smudged windows, and a hand-painted sign above the door advertising a 2-for-1 deal on breakfast sandwiches that had probably been there since 2019. She picked Pump 7 because it was at the far end, away from the other cars. Another old habit. Always know your exits. She swiped her card, started the fuel, and went inside to grab a water. The cashier, a young guy with a headset around his neck, and the look of someone who'd already been there 4 hours, barely glanced up. She picked a bottle from the refrigerated case near the back, and she was halfway to the register when she heard the car pull up outside. Fast. Engine noise louder than it needed to be. By the time she made it back through the door, there were 2 patrol vehicles parked at odd angles behind her Jeep, not blocking it exactly, but close enough to make a point. And a man in a police captain's uniform was already walking toward her like he'd rehearsed this. He was maybe 50. Thick in the shoulders, thinning on top, with a jaw that looked like it had been clenched for several decades. His name tag read Holt, Captain Douglas Holt, Redstone City Police Department, and he walked with the specific kind of confidence that comes from never having been seriously wrong about anything in recent memory. "Is that your vehicle?" He pointed at the Jeep without looking at it. Natalie stopped walking. "Yes." "You sure about that?" "Yes." "Because we've got a report of a vehicle matching that description. Gray Meridian, partial plate match. Reported stolen out of Delworth County 3 days ago." He said it the way men like him said things. Flat, conclusive, already decided. "The plate won't match," she said. "That's my vehicle. I bought it 22 months ago from Redstone Auto Group. I have the title." "I'd like to see your registration and license." She kept her voice even. "Of course." She reached into her bag, slowly, deliberately, because she understood how these situations could go wrong quickly, and produced her driver's license, her vehicle registration, and clipped behind it her hospital ID badge from Riverside Memorial. Holt looked at the license, looked at the registration, looked at her badge. Then he looked at the secondary card behind it, laminated, government issued, with a specific insignia in the top left corner, and his expression shifted, not softened, shifted, like a door closing rather than opening. "What is this?" He held up the laminated card. "Secondary identification," she said. "It's valid. You can run it." He turned it over. "This some kind of military ID?" "It's a credentialing card. You can verify it through the Department of Defense registry. The number is on the back." Holt looked at the card for another moment. Then he looked at her, the scrubs, the hospital bag, the fact that she was a woman standing alone at a gas station before 7 a.m. And something settled into place behind his eyes that had nothing to do with evidence. "This is fake," he said. She blinked. "It's not. I've been in law enforcement 26 years. I know what legitimate government credentials look like. And this," he tapped the card with one finger, "is not that. A nurse doesn't carry military credentials. You want to explain to me how you came to have this?" There were 3 other people at the pump island now. A man fueling a pickup truck had stopped what he was doing. A woman in a blue sedan had rolled down her window. And one teenager near the air pump had his phone out and pointed in their direction, which Natalie clocked without looking directly at it. "I'd like to explain it to you privately," she said. "What I'm holding is restricted documentation. Reading it out loud in public could—" "What you're holding," Holt said, raising his voice slightly, "is a fraudulent government document, which is a federal offense. And that vehicle behind you may be stolen property. So what I need you to do right now is step away from your bag, put your hands where I can see them, and wait while my officers run those plates." 2 uniformed officers had gotten out of the second patrol car. One of them was young, early 20s maybe, with the rigid posture of someone who'd graduated the academy within the last year. The other was older, mid-30s, with the specific blank expression of someone who had learned not to have opinions in front of his captain. Natalie did what she was told. She stepped away from her bag. She put her hands where they could see them. And while one of the officers walked to his cruiser to run the plates, she stood in the pale morning light of the Riverside Gas Mart and waited. She pressed 2 fingers against the inside of her left wrist. The motion was small, barely a motion at all. Under the skin, tucked against the tendons, the emergency locator emitted a pulse so short it registered as noise on any civilian scanner. But it wasn't meant for civilian scanners. She lowered her hand. Holt was watching her. "You nervous?" "No," she said. "Just cold." The officer came back from the cruiser. "Plates are clean, Captain. Vehicles registered to a Natalie Carter, Redstone City address." Holt's jaw tightened slightly. "And the stolen vehicle report?" "Still pulling it up, sir, but the partial plate they gave us is 3 digits different." A different kind of man would have paused, would have recalibrated, would have said, "All right, sorry for the trouble. We'll let you get on with your day." Holt was not that kind of man. "The partial could still be consistent," he said. He turned to Natalie. "I'm going to need you to come with us while we verify the vehicle." "On what grounds?" she asked. Not aggressive, genuinely asking. "On the grounds that I have a partial match on a stolen vehicle and a fraudulent government document in your possession." "The document isn't fraudulent," she said, "and a partial plate that doesn't match isn't probable cause to detain me." "Lady, my name is Natalie Carter. I've given you my license, my registration, and 2 forms of ID. The vehicle is registered to me. I'm due at work at Riverside Memorial in 45 minutes. I'm asking you politely to either charge me with something specific or let me go." Holt stared at her for a moment. The teenager's phone was still recording. The woman in the blue sedan hadn't moved. "Cuff her," Holt said. The young officer hesitated, a flicker, barely visible, a half second where his hand didn't move and his eyes went to the phone and then to his captain. And then he stepped forward and did what he was told. The cuffs went on in front of the gas station, in front of the phone camera, in front of the man in the pickup who had stopped pretending he wasn't watching. Natalie didn't resist. She didn't raise her voice. She looked at Captain Douglas Holt and said calmly and without any particular emotion, "You're making the biggest mistake of your career." "I've heard that before," he said. "I know," she said. "But this time it's accurate." The Redstone City Police Department's 4th Precinct was housed in a beige concrete building on Alderman Street that smelled like burnt coffee and industrial cleaner, and had the specific acoustic quality of a place where sound bounced off every surface and softened into nothing. Natalie had been in places that felt worse. She had been in places significantly worse. She sat in a processing chair and answered questions in a flat, cooperative voice, while a female officer did a pat-down and an evidence technician photographed her belongings. Her hospital badge went into a plastic tray. Her phone went into a plastic tray. Her keys went into a plastic tray. The laminated credentialing card went into a separate tray with a yellow evidence sticker on it, which she noted but did not comment on. Occupation? The intake officer was a woman in her 40s with reading glasses pushed up into her hair and the expression of someone who had done this particular task approximately 6,000 times. Emergency department nurse, Natalie said. Riverside Memorial Medical Center. Previous record? No. Any military service? There was a beat. Yes. The intake officer looked up for the first time. Branch? Army. When did you separate? Natalie looked at the wall for a moment. I didn't. The officer's pen stopped moving. My status is complicated, Natalie said. The ID card in that tray explains it better than I can in this room. I'd suggest whoever processes it runs it through the DoD portal rather than standard law enforcement databases. The intake officer wrote something down. What she wrote, Natalie couldn't see. It probably didn't matter. She was put in a holding cell, not a drunk tank, a regular cell, which meant Holt had processed this as an actual arrest rather than a detain and release. The cell had a metal bench along one wall, a drain in the floor, and a small frosted window near the ceiling that let in a rectangle of gray morning light. She sat down on the bench. She closed her eyes. She breathed slowly. In the tactical medical unit she had deployed with for 3 years, there was a protocol they called conserve and assess. It meant exactly what it sounded like. You didn't fight when fighting cost more than it bought. You went quiet. You gathered information. You waited for the terrain to shift in your favor. She had used it in worse places than a holding cell in Redstone City, and it had worked every time. She heard Holt in the hallway at one point, talking to someone, his voice carrying the particular texture of a man who was already writing his own version of the morning. Obvious fraud, and she had an attitude about it, refusing to cooperate, giving us legal speeches. She kept her eyes closed. 40 minutes after she was booked, her phone lit up in its evidence tray on the other side of the building. She didn't know that. But the desk officer who walked past it did a double take, because the screen was showing an incoming call from a number that was, on the surface, a standard DC area code. But the prefix was one she'd never seen in civilian use, and the caller ID displayed 6 letters that made her stop walking entirely. She stood there for a moment. Then she walked quickly in the direction of her supervisor's office. The fax machine in the Redstone 4th Precinct records room had not received a priority transmission in 11 months. At 8:47 that morning, it received 3 and 6 minutes. The duty sergeant, a man named Pruitt, who had been on the job for 17 years and had developed the ability to read a room by its paperwork, pulled the first transmission off the tray and read it twice. Then he walked it down the hall to Captain Holt's office and set it on the desk without saying anything. Holt read it. His face didn't change much, but his coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth and stayed there. The transmission was from the Office of Military Personnel Records. It acknowledged that an individual named Natalie Carter, identified by the credentialing card currently in the custody of the Redstone City Police Department's 4th Precinct, had been processed into their evidence system at approximately 0742 hours, and that said card was a valid, active document issued under restricted protocol. It noted that the holder's service record was protected under a limited access designation, and that any law enforcement agency requiring verification should contact the provided secure line immediately. The second fax was from the Department of the Army. It was shorter. It said that the individual currently detained by the 4th Precinct was known to the Army, that her credentials were legitimate, and that a legal representative was being dispatched. The third fax was not from any agency Holt recognized by name. It had a header he didn't know, a seal he'd never seen, and 4 lines of text that, when he read them a second time, made him set his coffee cup down on his desk because his hand had developed a slight tremor. He picked up his phone. "Get me the D.A.'s office," he said. The duty officer on the other end said, "Which one, sir?" "The one that answers at 8 a.m., Holt said. "Booked it." Natalie heard the change before she saw it. Footsteps that were moving differently, faster, less casual, the specific rhythm of people who had just received information they weren't expecting. Two voices in the corridor kept deliberately low, which meant someone was already aware of the camera in the hallway. The ventilation system ticked. Somewhere deeper in the building, a door opened and closed 3 times in rapid succession. She opened her eyes. The frosted window above her had brightened slightly. It was probably close to 9. She'd been here long enough for 2 shifts to change at the hospital, which meant the charge nurse at Riverside Memorial had already flagged her as absent without contact. That would create its own complications, but she'd deal with those later. The cell door opened at 9:17. It wasn't Holt. It was a younger officer she hadn't seen before, not the rookie from the gas station, someone else, mid-30s, with the look of a man who had been handed a task he wasn't entirely comfortable with. He had her belongings tray in his hands. "Ms. Carter," he said, we need you to come with us." She stood up. "Where?" "Conference room B." "Am I still under arrest?" He looked at the tray in his hands, then at the floor. "I'm not the right person to answer that." She followed him down the hall, past the front desk where the duty officer was typing very rapidly and not making eye contact with anything, past the break room where 2 officers stood close together talking in the specific hushed way that spreads through a workplace when something has gone wrong. Somewhere above pay grade, and into a conference room at the end of the corridor with a laminated sign on the door that read, "Conference B, authorized personnel only." Inside the conference room, there were 3 people she didn't recognize. One was a woman in a gray suit who had the kind of posture that came from standing in a lot of rooms where decisions were made. One was a man in Army service uniform with the silver oak leaf of a lieutenant colonel on his collar. And one was a woman in civilian clothes who had a legal pad in front of her, and a specific quality of stillness that Natalie associated, through long experience, with people who had the authority to arrest other people. "Ms. Carter," the woman in the gray suit said. "Natalie Carter, formerly Staff Sergeant Carter, 75th Combat Medical Brigade?" Natalie sat down. "Currently." The woman blinked. "I'm sorry?" "My discharge was never finalized," Natalie said. "I'm on extended administrative hold pending reclassification. My status is active reserve under restricted protocol. That's what the card says." The lieutenant colonel, who had been watching her since she walked in, made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. He looked at the woman in civilian clothes. "Who did they arrest?" he said. And across the table, Natalie Carter folded her hands and waited for the room to figure out what she already knew. Outside the conference room, in Holt's office down the hall, a second wave of communications had begun arriving. Not by fax this time, but through the department's encrypted communications terminal, the one that had been installed 18 months ago for federal coordination purposes and used, until that morning, approximately twice. The terminal was blinking with 3 queued messages, and when the desk officer opened the first one and read the sender credentials, she stood up immediately and went to find her shift commander. The shift commander read the message. He looked at the screen for a long moment. Then he walked down the hall toward Holt's office, and when he opened the door, Holt was on the phone, voice raised slightly, the specific tone of a man who was explaining himself to someone who was not interested in explanations. He looked up when his commander came in. His commander set a printed copy of the message on the desk in front of him. Holt read the first 2 lines. His voice, mid-sentence on the phone, stopped producing words. "Captain," his commander said quietly, "I think you need to end that call." Holt ended the call. He set the phone down with the careful, deliberate motion of a man buying himself 3 seconds to think, and in those 3 seconds his commander stood in the doorway and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say yet. The printed message sat on the desk between them. Holt read the first 2 lines again, as if they might have changed. They hadn't. The message was from the Office of the Judge Advocate General, United States Army. It was addressed to the commanding officer of the Redstone City Police Department's 4th Precinct by name, not by title, by name, which meant whoever sent it already knew exactly who was running this building. It stated, in language that was precise in the way that legal language is precise when written by people who intend to use it, that an individual currently in the custody of this precinct was subject to military personnel protections under a specific statutory code that Holt didn't recognize, but that his commander, who had spent 4 years working joint operations with federal agencies before coming to Redstone, recognized immediately. "How long has she been here?" his commander asked. Since approximately 7:45. 2 hours. Yes. His commander looked at the message again. Did anyone run the card through the DoD portal? Holt's jaw worked. We flagged it as potentially fraudulent. Did anyone run it? A pause. No. His commander walked to the window. Outside, Alderman Street was doing what it always did at mid-morning. A delivery truck double parked, a woman walking a dog, nothing indicating that anything unusual was happening inside this particular building. He stood there for a moment with his hands in his pockets, and then he turned around. Get your union rep on the phone, he said, and do it before you talk to anyone in that conference room. In conference room B, the woman in the gray suit, who had introduced herself as Diane Mercer from the Army's Personnel Security Division, was asking Natalie questions in the methodical way of someone who already knew most of the answers and was establishing a record rather than seeking information. The lieutenant colonel, whose name was Valdez, sat to her left and mostly listened. The woman with the legal pad, who had given her name as Sujin Park and identified herself as a JAG attorney, was writing continuously. When did you activate the emergency signal? Mercer asked. At the gas station, before the cuffs went on. You anticipated the arrest? Natalie considered that. I anticipated that the situation was heading somewhere I couldn't de-escalate verbally. The officer had made a determination, and he wasn't going to change it based on documentation he'd already decided was fake. Why not? Because the documentation contradicted the story he'd already told himself about who I was. Mercer wrote something. Were you injured during the arrest or transport? No. Did any officer make statements that you'd characterize as discriminatory? Natalie was quiet for a moment. She'd been careful with herself since she sat down in this room. Careful about how much she showed, about the pace of her answers, about not letting the events of the morning collect weight in her chest the way they wanted to. He said people like me didn't own vehicles like this, she said. He said it in front of witnesses. Park's pen moved faster. People like you, Mercer said. Not a question. That was his phrasing. Valdez, who had been looking at the table, looked up. I was perhaps 55 with the kind of face that had absorbed a lot of weather, and he said, with a flatness that was its own kind of anger, I want the name of every officer who was present at that gas station and in this building when she was processed. The door opened. The officer who had brought Natalie to the room, the mid-30s one who had looked at the floor, leaned in. Captain Holt he's requesting to be part of this conversation. He can request whatever he wants, Park said, without looking up from her legal pad. Right now he needs to stay where he is. The officer left. The door closed. In the silence that followed, Natalie heard the ventilation tick again, and from somewhere down the hall, the sound of a printer running continuously, page after page after page. The video had been online for 2 hours and 40 minutes before anyone at the 4th Precinct knew it existed. The teenager at the air pump had posted it on 3 platforms within 20 minutes of the arrest. It was 47 seconds long, shot in portrait mode, slightly shaky at the beginning because he'd had to angle his body to avoid being obvious about filming. The audio was clear enough. You could hear Holt's voice telling her the ID was fake. You could hear him say people like her. You could see the moment the cuffs went on. Natalie's hands, steady, no resistance. The young officer's face tight with something that wasn't quite conviction. The clip's original title, typed by a 17-year-old who had witnessed something that bothered him enough to post it before school, was Cop arrested a nurse for having a fancy car and called her military ID fake? By the time the first news alert picked it up, it had 43,000 views. By the time the second outlet ran it, it was at 112,000. The comments were doing what comments do, cycling between outrage and speculation and the specific kind of crowdsourced investigation that the internet performs on videos like this, where strangers in 7 time zones are working in parallel to identify every visible detail in a 47-second clip. Someone identified the gas station from the signage. Someone else identified the patrol car number. A third person, who claimed to work in military HR and may or may not have been telling the truth, posted a long comment about what the insignia on the credentialing card, visible for about 3 frames when Holt held it up, actually meant, and why the average local police captain would have absolutely no context for reading it correctly. That comment got 4,000 upvotes in 40 minutes. A journalist at the Redstone City Tribune, a woman named Okafor, who covered the courts and municipal beat and had the specific instinct for when a story was larger than its surface, saw the clip at 9:58 a.m. while eating a late breakfast at her desk. She watched it twice. She wrote the station's non-emergency line in her notebook. She wrote the hospital name from the badge visible in the clip. She circled both. Then she picked up the phone. Natalie didn't know about the video yet. She knew her phone was in an evidence tray somewhere in this building, and she knew that the people in this conference room were conducting themselves with the specific focused energy of professionals who had arrived with a purpose and were executing it. And she knew, because she was good at reading rooms, had been good at reading rooms since long before the Army formalized that skill into something with a tactical name, that the situation had shifted. What she didn't know, and what she was starting to sense from the pattern of footsteps outside the conference room door, was that it had shifted faster than even she had expected. At 10:15, Park set down her pen and looked directly at Natalie for the first time with something other than professional neutrality. "I need to tell you something before this goes further," she said. "There's a video." Natalie said, "How many views?" Park blinked. "You knew someone was filming." "I saw the phone. How many?" "As of 20 minutes ago, 160,000. It's moving fast." Natalie nodded. She didn't feel triumphant about it. She mostly felt tired and slightly aware of the fact that she hadn't eaten since the coffee she hadn't finished at 4:15 in the morning, and that the day she'd been planning, 12-hour shift, 2 patients she was particularly watching, a medication review she'd promised the attending she'd have done by lunch, was gone completely. "Okay," she said. "The department is going to want to manage this," Park said. "Captain Holt will likely issue a statement. His supervisors will issue a statement. There's going to be a version of events that—" "I know how it works," Natalie said. "I'm not sure you know how fast it's moving." "I know how fast these things move," Natalie said quietly. "I've seen it go both ways." Park looked at her for a moment. "We're going to get you out of here today. What happens after that is going to depend on what you want." "What I want," Natalie said, "is to go to work. I have a shift." Valdez across the table made that almost laugh sound again. He covered it with a cough, but not quickly enough. "Your shift," he said. "I have 2 patients in the post-surgical unit I've been tracking for a week. One of them is not doing well." She looked at him. "Can someone call the charge nurse at Riverside Memorial and tell them I'm going to be late?" "Ms. Carter," Mercer said carefully, "I don't think you're going to be able to— I understand there are things to deal with first. I'm not trying to walk out right now. I'm asking someone to make a phone call so my patients aren't left without information." She said it without any particular force, and that was the thing about it. The complete absence of drama. She wasn't performing composure. She just was composed, the way a person is composed when they have been in enough genuinely bad situations that this one, uncomfortable and unjust as it was, did not register in the same register. Mercer and Park exchanged a look. Park picked up her phone. The shift commander of the 4th Precinct was a man named Braddock, and he was having, by any reasonable measure, the worst Tuesday of his career, and it was not yet 11 a.m. In the last 90 minutes, he had received communications from the JAG office, the Army Personnel Security Division, a DoD oversight contact he had never personally interacted with before, and most recently a call from the mayor's office. Not the mayor, but the mayor's deputy chief of staff, which was actually worse, because it meant the mayor was watching this but not yet willing to put his name on the response. Braddock had also been contacted by 2 journalists, one of whom was Okafor from the Tribune, and he declined to comment on both calls, which he knew perfectly well would appear in the eventual story as the department declined to comment. He was in his office now, door closed, with Holt sitting across from him and Holt's union rep, a man named Garza, sitting beside Holt with a yellow legal pad, and the expression of someone who had seen worse and wasn't sure yet whether this qualified. "Walk me through the probable cause," Braddock said. He said it the way you say something you need on record, not because you expect the answer to satisfy you. "Partial plate match on a reported stolen vehicle," Holt said, "and a document that appeared fraudulent." "Appeared? I've never seen credentials like that in 26 years. That's not—" "Did you run it through the DoD portal before you cuffed her?" Holt's jaw. "The portal takes time. It takes 4 minutes, Douglas. I've used it. You run the number, you wait 4 minutes, you get a verification, or you get a denial." Braddock folded his hands on his desk. "You didn't wait 4 minutes." Garza made a small sound and wrote something on his legal pad. The plate match, Holt started. The plate was 3 digits off. Your own officer flagged that at the scene. Braddock leaned back. What did she say to you when you told her you were going to arrest her? A pause. She said I was making a mistake. And? Holt looked at the wall to the left of Braddock's head. She said it would be the biggest mistake of my career. Braddock was quiet for a moment. Do you know what her service record contains? No, it's restricted. Right, it's restricted. He picked up the top sheet from the stack of faxes on his desk and set it in front of Holt without comment. Holt read it. His face did several things in a short period of time. The classification level on her personnel file, Braddock said, is something I have never personally encountered in 17 years of law enforcement. I don't know what she did. I don't think we're cleared to know what she did, but the fact that it's classified at that level. He stopped, pressed 2 fingers against his mouth for a second. Garza, I want to be honest with you. I'm not sure what union protections are going to be relevant here, because I'm not sure this is going to stay a local matter past the end of today. Garza looked up. What does that mean? It means that the woman in conference room B has federal representation, an active military status that I don't fully understand, and a 47-second video that is currently on its way to 200,000 views. It means the mayor's office has already called. It means I have 3 separate federal communications sitting on my desk, 2 of which arrived within 6 minutes of each other. He looked at Holt. And it means that whatever this was going to be when you put the cuffs on at that gas station, it is not that anymore. Holt said nothing. Outside the office, the printer was still running. Wob. Natalie was given back her phone at 11:03. Park handed it to her across the conference room table and said, We've processed your belongings out of evidence. You're no longer being detained. Formally. Natalie took the phone. The screen showed 42 missed calls, 17 text messages, and a notification from a news app that she hadn't opened in 2 weeks. She put the phone face down on the table. What's the department's position right now? She asked. Right now, they're managing internally. That'll change in the next few hours. Park glanced at Mercer. The captain who arrested you is currently in his commander's office. The department hasn't issued a statement. They will. Yes. And when they do, it's going to matter what you say first. Park's voice was careful. Not manipulative, but deliberate. Lieutenant Colonel Valdez and I are here in an advisory capacity. We're not telling you what to do, but you have options, and some of them have time windows. Natalie turned the phone over and looked at the screen. She scrolled past the missed calls without reading them, past the texts. 1 from a colleague at the hospital, 3 from a number she didn't recognize, several from her building's front desk, which was strange, and opened the news app. The headline she found was not the one she'd expected to find first. Nurse arrested at Redstone gas station. Was she carrying classified military credentials? The story was 6 paragraphs. It had the video embedded. Below the video, the comments were the particular kind of chaotic that happens when people are angry and don't have enough information and are filling the gaps with what they think they know. She read 2 paragraphs of the article and closed it. I need to know, she said, what the department told the hospital. Mercer straightened slightly. What do you mean? Someone called Riverside Memorial this morning. They flagged me as a no-call, no-show. That's procedure and that's fine. But in the last hour, something happened. I can see it in my messages from the front desk. And I need to know if the department made a second call. Park and Mercer looked at each other. It was a look that lasted about 1 second, but Natalie had been reading people under pressure for a long time. What did they tell the hospital? She said again. Park set her pen down. There was a call from the department's public affairs office. The framing was that you had been arrested on suspicion of vehicle theft and document fraud, and that you would be unable to report to your shift. Natalie was quiet. At the time they made the call, Park said, it was technically, I know what it was technically, Natalie said. Her voice was even, flat. She put her phone in her bag. They called my employer before any of this was resolved. Before you arrived, before anyone had verified anything. Yes. She stood up. She wasn't tall and the conference room wasn't particularly small, but when she stood up, she took up space in a way that she hadn't when she was sitting, some quality of her posture or the way she set her feet that suggested she had stood up in rooms where it mattered. I need to speak to whoever made that call, she said. Natalie, that call went to my charge nurse. My charge nurse called my attending. My attending called HR. She said each step with the specific knowledge of someone who understood exactly how institutional chains of information worked. By now, there are 3 levels of hospital administration who have been told by this police department that I am a criminal. That information does not disappear when this gets resolved. It goes in a file, it sits in an HR system. And 6 months from now, when I'm up for a unit lead position or a credentialing review or a transfer application, someone opens that file and sees that Redstone City PD called Riverside Memorial Medical Center and reported me as an arrested suspect. The room was quiet. That call, she said, was not procedure. That was a choice. Park picked up her pen. She wrote something at the top of a new page. Natalie could see from where she was standing that it was underlined twice. The door to the conference room opened again. It was the mid-30s officer, and this time his face had moved past the controlled blankness of earlier in the morning into something more specific. Stress. The particular kind that sits just below the surface when you know something bad is coming and you don't know exactly what shape it will take. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, "but there are 2 news vans outside the building." Mercer stood. Valdez stood. Park capped her pen. "Already," Mercer said. "Not a question. They've been there about 10 minutes, and there's someone from the mayor's office is also here. In person." He looked at the room. "He's asking to speak with the department's commanding officer and—" He stopped. "And with Miss Carter." Natalie picked up her bag. She looked at the officer who had been standing in doorways all morning delivering information he hadn't asked to deliver, and she said, not unkindly, "What's your name?" He blinked. "Reyes. Officer Reyes." "Were you at the gas station this morning?" "No, ma'am. I came on shift at 9. She nodded. "Okay." She looked at Park. "Let's go talk to the mayor's office." Park nodded. She gathered her legal pad, and then she paused and looked at Natalie with a directness that had a different quality than the professional focus of the last 2 hours. "For what it's worth," she said, "I've done about 40 of these. The way you handled the arrest, the processing, this room—" She stopped. "You didn't give them anything." "I didn't have anything to give them," Natalie said. "That's not what I mean." Natalie looked at her. "I know what you mean." She moved toward the door. "But the morning's not finished yet." She was right about that. Outside, one of the 2 news vans had positioned itself across the street, with a clear sight line to the precinct's front entrance, and the cameraman on the sidewalk was already rolling, catching the building's beige facade, the patrol cars in the lot, the ordinary Tuesday morning street that had stopped being ordinary sometime before 8 a.m. and wasn't going to go back to being ordinary for a while. And inside, in Captain Holt's office, a second communication had just arrived through the encrypted terminal. Not from the JAG office, not from Army personnel, but from a division whose name Braddock read 3 times before he fully processed it. He printed it. He read it again. He picked up his phone and called Garza, who was still in the building, and said 4 words that were not what Garza had expected to hear. "We need to talk now." Garza was there in 90 seconds. He read the printed message. He set it down on Holt's desk, and he was quiet for a moment in the way of someone recalculating everything they thought they understood about a situation from the beginning. "Douglas," he said slowly, "what exactly did she whisper to you right before you put the cuffs on?" Holt said nothing. "Because if she said what I think she said—" Garza stopped. He looked at the paper again. Then he looked at Holt. "This division doesn't get involved in local arrests. They don't get involved in federal arrests. The cases where they get involved—" He put the paper face down on the desk. "You need to tell me right now. What did she say?" Holt said it quietly, like a man reading from a document he wished he'd never seen. She said, "You're making the biggest mistake of your career." Garza stared at him. "That's it? That's it?" Garza picked up the paper again, read it one more time, and set it back down. He was quiet for a long moment in the way of a man who had built a professional life around knowing when to talk and when to stop, and he had very clearly just hit the stop point. "Douglas," he said finally, "I need you to understand something. I've represented officers in excessive force complaints, wrongful arrest suits, civil rights cases. I know how to work those." He tapped the paper with one finger. "I don't know how to work this." "What does that mean?" "It means call your wife." He stood up. Because I think today is the last day you're going to have a quiet phone. The mayor's deputy chief of staff was a man named Aldrich, 40-something, in a suit that was too good for a Tuesday morning precinct visit, which meant he'd come directly from somewhere else and hadn't had time to change. He was waiting in the precinct's front reception area, with the controlled impatience of a man who charged by the hour and had been sitting for 20 minutes, and when Braddock came out to meet him, he stood immediately. "Where is she?" Aldrich asked. "Miss Carter is in conference room B with federal representatives." Federal. Aldrich said it the way people say a word when they need a second to absorb what it means in context. "What branch?" "Army JAG and Personnel Security." Braddock kept his voice flat. "We also have a communication from a DoD oversight division that I'm not going to name in this hallway." Aldrich looked at him steadily. "The mayor wants this resolved today." "I understand." "He wants a public statement before noon. He wants the department's position to be that this was an isolated error that is being investigated internally, and he wants Ms. Carter publicly." Aldrich stopped, because Natalie had just come through the door from the hallway behind Braddock, Park at her shoulder, Mercer and Valdez a step behind. The room adjusted. That was the only way to describe it. Everyone in the reception area, the desk officer, the two uniformed cops near the door, Aldrich, Braddock, all of them shifted slightly, a collective recalibration, the way a space changes when someone walks into it who has a different center of gravity than expected. Natalie looked at Aldrich. "You're from the mayor's office." "Deputy Chief of Staff Aldrich, Is the mayor prepared to make a statement today?" Aldrich blinked. He hadn't expected her to lead. We're working on the framing." "I'm not asking about framing," she said. "I'm asking if the mayor is prepared to say publicly that this arrest was wrong, that the officer's conduct was discriminatory, and that the department failed its own verification protocols." She said it without heat, with the same flat directness she'd used in the conference room, and Aldrich looked at her the way people look at someone when they're revising their expectations in real time. "Because if he is, we can talk about framing. If he's not, then I need to know that now so I can plan my afternoon accordingly." Aldrich glanced at Braddock. Braddock looked at the floor, which was as much an answer as anything he could have said aloud. "Ms. Carter," Aldrich said carefully, "the mayor is committed to accountability. He is. But there's a process. There's a video," Park said from behind Natalie's shoulder, "with 240,000 views as of 30 minutes ago. The process is going to happen with or without the mayor getting ahead of it." Aldrich closed his mouth. He opened it again. He said, "Can we do this somewhere that isn't the front desk?" They moved to a larger conference room, Conference A, the one with the long table, and the projector screen that still had a smear of dry erase marker across one corner from the last briefing nobody had cleaned up. Braddock sat at the head. Aldrich sat to his left. Park and Mercer sat across from them. Valdez stood near the wall with his arms folded, which was a choice that communicated something. Natalie sat at the far end of the table. She sat there and watched them talk about her situation as if she were a variable in an equation, and she let it happen for approximately 6 minutes, and then she put both hands flat on the table. "I want to be clear about something," she said. The conversation stopped. "I didn't come into this room to negotiate. I came into this room because Ms. Park thought it would be useful for me to hear your position directly." She looked at Aldrich. "Your position is that you want a quiet resolution that makes the mayor look responsive without making the department look catastrophically incompetent. I understand that position, but I need you to understand mine." "We're listening," Aldrich said. "The officer who arrested me made a judgment call in a public place, in front of witnesses and cameras. The judgment call was based on what I was driving and what I looked like, not on what the evidence said. He ignored valid documents. He escalated when the evidence didn't support escalation. And then this department called my employer and told them I was an arrested suspect before anything was verified." She said it in 4 clean sentences. No extra words. That's 3 separate problems. The public statement needs to address all 3, not just the first one. The call to your employer may have been standard. It was not standard, Park said, and her voice had a different quality now, the specific sharpness of a lawyer who had finished being patient. Standard procedure is next of kin notification in the event of medical emergency or injury. It is not contacting a detainee's employer with unverified criminal allegations. There's case law on this, and I can have it in this room in 40 minutes. Aldrich looked at Braddock again. This time Braddock looked back, and what passed between them was a wordless acknowledgement that this had moved past the point where any amount of careful positioning was going to make the terrain comfortable. "What do you want?" Aldrich said. He was talking to Natalie, and he was asking it with the directness of a man who had decided that the detour wasn't working. She looked at him. "A full and public retraction of the arrest. A correction sent to Riverside Memorial Hospital's HR and administrative records. A formal internal review of the arrest and verification protocols. And Captain Holt suspended pending investigation." "Suspended pending," Braddock started. "He arrested someone without probable cause, ignored valid federal identification, and used language in public that you don't want in an audio clip on the evening news." She let that sit for a second. "I'm not asking for his head. I'm asking for the standard response to a serious procedural violation. That's all." The room was quiet for a moment that lasted just long enough to be uncomfortable. Then Valdez, from his spot near the wall, spoke for the first time since they'd sat down. "While you're working through that," he said, "I have a separate matter." He unfolded his arms and put a folder on the table. Not a thick folder, 4 or 5 pages maybe, but he slid it toward Braddock with a deliberateness that made everyone at the table look at it. "Ms. Carter's credentialing card, the one your officer characterized as fraudulent." He tapped the folder. "I'd like to walk through what that card actually represents." Braddock opened the folder. He read the top page. His expression shifted in the small, controlled way of someone who was experienced enough to not show the full register of what he was feeling. "Is this classified?" he asked. "The summary I gave you is not classified," Valdez said. "The underlying service record is. What you're looking at is a declassified summary, sufficient for verification purposes." He paused. "It should be sufficient for you to understand why we're here, and why this division notified us within 20 minutes of your department logging her credentials into your evidence system." Aldrich leaned over to read the page. He got 3 lines in and straightened up. He looked at Natalie at the far end of the table with an expression that had changed in a way that was hard to categorize. Not quite respect, not quite alarm, somewhere in a register between those two things that doesn't have a clean word. "You're still active," he said. "Administrative hold," she said. "Active reserve. Restricted. And you've been working as a nurse at Riverside Memorial for 14 months. He was quiet. "Why?" She looked at him for a moment. It was a personal question, the kind of question that didn't belong in this room, and they both knew it. "Because I'm good at it," she said. "And because after what I did before, I needed something where I was helping people who could tell me whether it was working." Nobody said anything for a few seconds. The printer down the hall had finally stopped running. Okafor from the Tribune got through to the precinct's public affairs office at 11:40 and was told, politely and briefly, that the department had no comment at this time. She had expected that. She had also, in the 2 hours since she'd seen the video, done several other things. She'd contacted a military records researcher she used occasionally, sent the credentialing card insignia, visible for 3 frames in the clip, to the researcher with the question, "What is this and what does it mean?" And she'd driven to the Riverside Gas Mart. The gas station was a 20-minute drive from the paper. By the time she got there, 2 of the station's employees had already been approached by other journalists, which meant the morning's footage had spread further and faster than even the comment section had indicated. She found the teenager. His name, she'd gotten from a brief exchange online, was Marcus, 17, and he'd gone to school that morning and come home at lunch to find himself briefly internet famous, through the cashier who remembered him. Marcus lived 4 blocks from the station. He opened his front door looking like a kid who hadn't fully processed that the video he'd posted between sending a homework assignment and eating breakfast had become a news item. He let Okafor in because she had a press credential and a calm manner, and because his mother, who was sitting in the kitchen and was significantly more skeptical, decided after 2 minutes that the conversation was acceptable. "Tell me exactly what you saw," Okafor said. Marcus told her. He was 17 and he wasn't performing it. He said the parts he was certain about and flagged the parts he was less sure of, which Okafor noted because not everyone did that. He said the officer's tone was aggressive before he'd looked at any documents. He said the woman, Natalie, had been completely calm the whole time, even when the cuffs went on. He said the thing that made him start recording was when the officer said people like her, because he'd heard that phrase before, and he knew what it meant, and he knew it wasn't about the car. "Did she say anything to the officer before they took her?" Okafor asked. Yeah. Marcus looked at his phone, but he'd watched his own clip back multiple times, apparently. She said, "You're making the biggest mistake of your career." Real quiet. Like she wasn't scared, like she already knew something he didn't. Okafor wrote that down. She underlined it. By the time she got back to the Tribune at 12:30, her military records researcher had responded. She read the response twice. She sat very still at her desk for about 30 seconds. Then she opened a new document and started writing, because the story she'd thought she had at 9:58 that morning was a different story than the one she had now, and the new one was significantly larger. The mayor made a statement at 1:15 p.m. It was 2 paragraphs, read from a lectern outside City Hall, and it said that the city was committed to accountability and that the arrest this morning was being reviewed at the highest levels of the department and that the city would be transparent with its findings. It did not use the word wrong. It did not use the word discriminatory. It said the officer involved had been placed on administrative leave pending review. Park, watching it on her phone in the parking lot of the 4th Precinct, said something under her breath that was not appropriate for a professional setting. She called Mercer. "He said administrative leave, not suspension." "I heard. That's not what we agreed." "I know." Mercer's voice had a controlled tightness in it. "Aldrich walked it back after we left the room." "Does Natalie know?" "She's in the car with Valdez. I'm going to tell her now." Natalie heard it with the kind of stillness that comes after a point of impact, the moment between when something hits and when the body decides what to do next. She was sitting in Valdez's rental car in the precinct parking lot, eating a granola bar that Reyes, the mid-30s officer who kept appearing in doorways, had quietly left outside Conference A at some point during the morning and that Park had picked up without comment. She hadn't eaten since 4:15. The granola bar was stale and slightly too sweet, and she ate it in 6 bites. "Administrative leave," she said. "That's what he said," Mercer told her. She chewed the last of the bar, looked out the windshield at the precinct building, beige and fixed in the afternoon light. "What's the JAG position on that?" "That it's insufficient given what the investigation is going to find, but we can't compel the department's disciplinary decisions." "Not yet," Valdez said quietly from the driver's seat. She looked at him. "What does that mean?" "It means there's a federal angle to this that's not fully visible yet." He started the car. "The division that flagged your detention, they don't move fast. When they move completely. What happened today set something in motion that this department doesn't fully understand yet." He pulled out of the parking lot. "Neither does the mayor." She watched the precinct building recede in the side mirror. "Where are we going?" "Riverside Memorial," he said. "You said you had patience." She turned and looked at him. He was watching the road. "I can get you in through the staff entrance and have someone return your vehicle from the station this afternoon," he said, "unless you'd rather not." She thought about the 2 patients she'd been tracking, room 412 and the ICU transfer in 408. She thought about the file in HR that was going to have this morning's events in it and the way that file would sit until someone opened it. She thought about walking back into that hospital while her name was circulating on news apps. "No," she said. "Take me in." Quote. The ER charge nurse at Riverside Memorial was a woman named Delgado, who had worked the department for 11 years and had developed the ability to conduct an entire evaluation of a situation in the time it took to walk from one end of the nurses' station to the other. When Natalie came through the staff entrance at 1:55 p.m. with a JAG attorney at her shoulder and a look on her face that was completely normal on the surface, and not normal in ways that Delgado clocked immediately, Delgado said nothing for a full 3 seconds. Then she said, "You eat anything today?" "1 granola bar." "I'll get you something from the break room. Park says you're on reduced hours this afternoon pending." "I'm not on reduced hours," Natalie said. "I'm on my regular shift. Who's covering 412? "Brennan. He's been there all morning." Delgado fell into step beside her. "Natalie, HR called the floor twice today." "I know." The attending, "I'll talk to Dr. Voss when I have a window." She pushed through the door to the nursing station. The unit was doing what the unit always did at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday, running at about 80% of its comfortable capacity, the particular mid-afternoon rhythm of a hospital that has processed the morning emergencies and hasn't yet absorbed the evening ones. 2 nurses she knew looked up when she came in. A third one looked at his phone, then back at her, and she understood in that moment that the video had made it here before she had. She went to the computer at her station, logged in, pulled up 412's chart. The patient in 412 was a 61-year-old man named Tarver, post-operative day 4 from an aortic valve replacement. His numbers that morning were worse than they'd been the night before. Not catastrophically, but trending in a direction that required watching. She read through Brennan's notes from the last 6 hours, her eyes moving fast, and found 2 things she would have flagged differently. She didn't say that to anyone. She updated the monitoring order and went to the room. Tarver was awake, which was better than she'd expected. He was a large man, naturally the kind of large that made hospital beds look slightly inadequate, and he had the specific look of someone who had been thinking too much in a room by himself and needed a person to talk to rather than just check on him. "You're back," he said. "I'm back." She checked his IV line, looked at the monitor readings, pressed 2 fingers lightly to his wrist out of habit, even though the monitor was doing the same thing more precisely. "I heard something about you," he said, "on my daughter's phone. She was here this morning and she had... Is it true?" She looked at him. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "You okay?" The question surprised her. Not the fact of it. Tarver was that kind of person, had been since she started seeing him 3 days ago. But the timing of it. She was the one supposed to be asking that. "I'm fine," she said. "How's the incision feeling?" "Like someone cut me open and put a machine part in my chest." He watched her. "You don't have to pretend with me." "I'm not pretending. I need to know about the incision." She helped him shift position slightly, checked the wound site through the gown. The inflammation at the lower margin was slightly more than yesterday. She made a note. "That cop," Tarver said, "is going to regret it." "He's already regretting it," she said. "Try to breathe evenly for me." He breathed. She watched the monitor. The rhythm was sinus, but slightly fast, which had been the pattern. "You know what I was before the surgery?" he asked. "Before I retired." "What?" "Defense attorney. 23 years. He looked at the ceiling. "I've seen what happens when law enforcement makes a mistake this size in front of a camera. You understand what's about to come down on that man?" She understood perfectly well. "I need you focused on getting your heart rate down," she said. "Not on anything else." "Both at once," he said. "I'm multi-talented." She almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. Park called at 3:47 while Natalie was in the break room eating a sandwich she'd found in the staff refrigerator with her name on it, which meant Delgado had done that during morning shift. The bread was slightly dry and she ate it anyway. "Okafor's piece just went up," Park said. "Tribune Online." "How bad?" "For you? Not bad at all. For the department?" A pause. "She got your military researcher summary, or something close to it. She's not naming specifics because they're restricted, but she's contextualized it enough that people reading it will understand that what your credentials represent is significantly beyond what Holt claimed they were." Natalie put down the sandwich. "Does it name Holt?" "By name, rank, and 26-year service history, yes. She also named the 2 officers who were with him at the scene." A pause. "And she quoted Marcus." "The kid." She quoted him directly, about what Holt said. "People like her. In print now. Attributed. On record." "The department is going to need to respond to the piece," Park said. "When they do, they're going to be in an impossible position. Any response that defends the arrest will contradict the video. Any response that concedes the arrest was wrong opens them up to the civil suit they're currently terrified of." "I haven't said anything about a civil suit." "I know. They don't know that." Natalie looked at the sandwich. "What happens next?" "Mercer is meeting with Valdez and someone from the DoD Oversight Office at 5. I'll be there. We're going to put formal pressure on the department to move from administrative leave to suspension with cause." Park's voice was even, but underneath it there was something moving. Not excitement exactly, but the specific engagement of a person who was good at a thing and was currently doing it. "The video is at 480,000 views. The national wires picked it up an hour ago." Natalie said nothing. "I need to ask you something," Park said. "And you don't have to answer right now, but the DoD Oversight Office is looking at this not just as a civil rights issue. They're looking at it as a case involving how law enforcement handles encounters with individuals who carry restricted federal credentials. That's a policy question, not just a legal one. They've asked whether you'd be willing to participate in a formal review. What does participation look like? Testimony, not public, a closed review board. Your account of the encounter, the verification failure, the call to your employer. It would be used to develop standardized protocol for situations like this, so that the next person carrying credentials like yours doesn't spend 2 hours in a holding cell because an officer doesn't know how to use a DoD portal. Natalie looked at the wall above the break room coffee machine where someone had pinned a cartoon that was faded enough to be unreadable and a printed copy of the hospital's hand hygiene protocol and a birthday card for a person named Justine, whose last name she didn't know. The ordinary debris of a working life. "Yes," she said. "Tell them yes." She picked up the sandwich and finished it. She was due back on the floor in 4 minutes. At 4:20 p.m., a black SUV with federal government plates pulled into the parking structure of the Redstone City Police Department's 4th Precinct. 3 people got out, 2 in civilian clothes and 1 in Army service uniform with a rank insignia that made the parking structure attendant look twice and then look away. They went inside. They did not stop at the front desk. The desk officer reached for the phone, but one of the people in civilian clothes put an ID on the desk briefly, long enough to be seen, and said, "We're expected." She took it back before the officer could read it fully, but what the officer saw in that half second, the specific seal in the upper right corner, made her pick the phone up again immediately after they'd passed, not to stop them, but to call Braddock. Braddock was in his office. He answered on the second ring, and when she told him what she'd seen, he was quiet for a moment and then said, "Send them up." He hung up. He looked at his desk, the stacked faxes, the printed messages, the folder Valdez had left that morning, the half-cold cup of coffee he'd been carrying around since 9 a.m. and not drinking. He stood up and put on his uniform jacket. He had the specific feeling of a man standing in the last quiet moment before an event he cannot stop and isn't sure he wants to. Down the hall, in the office where Holt had been sitting in administrative purgatory since noon, waiting for guidance from his union rep that kept being delayed by phone calls that Garza wasn't sharing the content of, Holt heard the footsteps in the corridor change character. More of them. Moving with the specific cadence of people who are not asking permission for their presence. He went to his door, opened it, looked down the hall. The 3 people from the parking structure were walking toward Braddock's office. The civilian man at the front had a folder under his arm, and the uniformed officer behind him was carrying a sealed evidence bag. The third person, the woman, peeled off from the group as they passed Holt's office and stopped directly in front of him. She looked at him the way people look at something they've been told about and are now seen in person. Not unfriendly. Not friendly. "Captain Holt," she said. "Yes." "My name is Supervisory Special Agent Verone. I'm with the Department of Defense Inspector General's office." She showed her credential. He looked at it. "I need you to stay in your office for the next 30 minutes. Someone will come to you." She paused. "Please don't use your personal phone until they do." She walked on down the hall before he could respond. Holt stood in his doorway. The corridor was empty now. Somewhere in the building, a door closed. He stood there for another moment, and then he went back inside his office, and he sat down, and he picked up his personal phone out of habit. He put it back down. He looked at the wall. On the wall was a commendation from the city, framed, dated 7 years ago. Beside it, a photo from a department event, him in the center, hands on the shoulders of 2 newer officers, everyone smiling. The photo was dusty. He hadn't noticed that before. 30 seconds later, his office phone rang. He looked at the display. It was a number he didn't recognize, and the prefix was the same one from the encrypted communications terminal that had been sending messages to the department since 8 that morning. He answered it. The person on the other end said, "Captain Holt, this is the office of the Inspector General. Before we come in, I need to inform you that this conversation is being recorded. Do you understand?" He said that he did. "Good," the voice said. "Then let's start from the beginning. Tell me exactly what happened at the Riverside Gas Mart at approximately 7:30 this morning. Take your time. We have all the footage." Holt told it the way men tell things when they know the record is running and they haven't yet decided how much the truth is going to cost them, carefully, with small omissions that he probably thought were invisible, the kind of gaps that feel like breathing room and are actually the opposite. He said the partial plate match had been called in by dispatch. He He said the document looked wrong to him based on his experience. He said she had been uncooperative. The voice on the phone let him finish. Then it said, "Captain Holt, I'm going to read you the dispatch log from this morning. The partial plate report was filed at 6:58 a.m. The plate on Ms. Carter's vehicle is not a partial match to that report. It shares 2 digits out of 7. Your own officer flagged the discrepancy at the scene. You proceeded with the arrest anyway." A pause that was not a pause. It was a space left deliberately, the way a surgeon leaves a space before making a cut. "I'd like you to explain that decision." Holt said nothing for 3 seconds. "In my judgment, the circumstantial—" "What circumstance?" the voice said. "She was fueling her own registered vehicle. She presented 3 forms of valid identification. The plate didn't match. What circumstance are you referring to?" Down the hall, the door to Braddock's office was closed, and had been closed for 18 minutes, and from the outside it was producing no sound at all, which was its own kind of information to anyone who knew how to read a building. The DoD Inspector General's team worked with the specific, unhurried efficiency of people who had done this before in bigger rooms than this one, and had never once needed to raise their voices to get what they came for. Special Agent Verone sat across from Braddock for 40 minutes with a tablet showing the full dispatch log, the arrest record, the evidence intake form, the timestamps on every fax and encrypted communication the department had received that morning, and the call log from the precinct's public affairs office, including the 11:22 a.m. call to Riverside Memorial Hospital's Human Resources Department. Braddock answered her questions in the measured way of a man who had decided that full cooperation was his only remaining play and was executing it without drama. He had sent the department's legal counsel a text at 4:03 that said you need to be here by 5 and received no response yet. He had stopped trying to manage the shape of the conversation and was simply answering what was asked. "The call to the hospital," Verone said. "Who authorized it?" "Our public affairs officer made it as standard notification." "Standard notification is next of kin. This was Miss Carter's employer." "I understand that now." "Did you authorize it?" "I was not consulted." Verone wrote something. "Who was?" Braddock looked at his desk for a moment. "Captain Holt's office coordinates with public affairs on active arrests. The call would have been made at his direction or with his knowledge." "And at 11:22, what was the status of the verification process?" "Incomplete." The DoD portal response had already been received at that point, had it not? The first fax came at 8:47. Yes. So at 11:22, your department had already received federal communication indicating that Ms. Carter's credentials were valid, and a call was made to her employer characterizing her as a criminal suspect. Braddock was quiet. "Yes," he said. Verone looked at him for a moment, not unkindly, with the specific neutrality of someone who has been told many things in many rooms and has learned to receive all of them the same way. "Commander Braddock," she said, "I want to be direct with you, because I think it's more useful than the alternative. This investigation is going to establish, through your own records, a sequence of events that is going to be very difficult for this department to characterize as an isolated error. The arrest itself could potentially be framed as a judgment failure. The failure to verify credentials could potentially be framed as a procedural gap. But the call to Ms. Carter's employer, made after federal verification had already been received at the direction of the arresting officer, that is not a gap. That is a choice." She closed the tablet cover. "And it's the kind of choice that changes the category of what we're looking at." Braddock put both hands flat on his desk. He looked like a man who had been standing on a shoreline watching a wave come in for the last 8 hours, and had finally run out of beach. "What category," he said, "are we looking at? At minimum, unlawful detention, civil rights violation, and deliberate harassment of a federal credential holder. At maximum." She picked up the tablet again. "That depends on what Captain Holt says in the next 20 minutes. Holt said the wrong things. Not all of them. Some of what he said was careful, deflective, the product of 26 years of understanding how official statements worked. But there were 3 places where he said the wrong thing, and each one landed in the recording like a stone going through ice. The first was when he was asked why he hadn't waited for the DoD portal verification before proceeding with the arrest. He said, "In my experience, that documentation didn't look like anything issued by a legitimate military branch." He said, in my experience, as if experience was a substitute for procedure, and the IG investigator on the phone let it sit there without comment, which was worse than any response would have been. The second was when he was asked about the phrase "people like her," documented in the video and quoted in the Tribune piece that had been live for 3 hours. He said, "I don't recall saying that." He said it evenly and without hesitation, which told the investigator more than a nervous answer would have. The third was when he was asked whether he had directed the call to Riverside Memorial Hospital. He said, "Public Affairs makes those calls on active arrests. I don't direct individual communications." It was technically a deflection, not a lie, but the investigator had already seen the text message, recovered from the precinct's internal communications system, sent from Holt's department phone at 11:08, that said to the public affairs officer, "Call the hospital. She's processed. Let them know she won't be in." 14 minutes after Holt's phone call ended, Verone's colleague walked down the hall to his office with a document in hand and knocked on the open door. Holt looked up. "Captain Holt," the man said, "I'm placing you on notice of formal investigation under 42 U.S.C. Section 1983, civil rights violation under color of law, and 18 U.S.C. Section 1519, falsification of records in a federal proceeding." He set the document on Holt's desk. "Your department-issued phone and computer are being secured as evidence. Please do not attempt to access either." Holt looked at the document. He looked at it for a long time without picking it up. "I want my attorney," he said. "That's your right," the man said. "Someone will stay with you until they arrive." The news broke at 6:14 p.m. Not the arrest of Holt. That wouldn't be public until the following morning. But the full scope of the story, as Okafor had assembled it, updated, and expanded from the afternoon's first version. The new piece had details that the morning piece hadn't. The timestamps establishing that federal verification had been received before the call to the hospital was made. The text message to public affairs, which had been described to her by a source within the department as a communication that contradicts the department's official account, and a statement from Park, attributed to a legal representative of Ms. Natalie Carter, that read, "This was not a failure of procedure. This was a deliberate sequence of choices made by an individual officer who decided that a black woman driving an expensive vehicle and carrying military credentials she couldn't possibly have earned was a more plausible story than the evidence in front of him." The piece had the video embedded again. It also had a second video, shorter, 15 seconds, shot from a different angle by someone who had been at the opposite pump island and had come forward that afternoon. This one showed something the first clip didn't. Holt looking at Natalie's credentialing card, then looking at her, and then looking at the car. The sequence. The decision forming in real time. The new clip went to 200,000 views in 90 minutes. Natalie finished her shift at 7:30. Tarver in 412 had stabilized. His rate had come down to a range she was comfortable with by 5 p.m., and the attending had adjusted his medication on her recommendation, which he'd made without any particular ceremony, the same way he always made adjustments she recommended, because she had a 14-month record of being right about the things she flagged. The patient in 408 was sleeping when she checked at 7, and his numbers were better than morning. She changed out of her scrubs in the staff locker room and sat on the bench for a moment with her bag in her lap. The locker room was empty. The ventilation hummed. Somewhere in the building, an elevator dinged. Her phone had 61 missed calls and messages she hadn't opened since the break room at 3:47. She opened Park's most recent text. "Holt, under formal IG investigation. Text when you're out of shift. We need to talk about tomorrow." She typed back, "Just done. Call in 10. She stood up, pulled on her jacket, and looked at herself briefly in the mirror on the inside of the locker door. She looked like someone who had been awake since 4:15 and had worked a hospital shift after being arrested and spent 3 hours in a federal proceeding. She looked, in other words, exactly like what she was. She closed the locker and went out. Delgado was at the nurse's station when Natalie passed. She was charting, but she looked up, and for a moment she just looked, taking in whatever she saw. And then she said, "You eat dinner? I'll get something on the way home. There's leftover soup in the break room from someone's birthday thing this morning." Natalie stopped. "I'll take it." She ate the soup in a paper cup standing at the break room counter, the way she'd eaten approximately a third of her meals in this building over the past 14 months. Standing, fast, tasting about 60% of it, because her mind was somewhere else. The soup was potato, slightly oversalted, and it was the best thing she'd eaten all day by a significant margin. Park called at 7:42. Are you somewhere you can talk? Break room. I'm alone. Okay. Park's voice was moving differently, still controlled, but with something underneath it that was closer to energy than calm. Here's where we are. Holt is under formal IG investigation. The department is aware that the text message to public affairs has been obtained. Braddock has retained private counsel, which means he's separating his representation from the department's, that's a significant signal. He's protecting himself from the department. Yes, which means the department's official account and Braddock's personal account are about to start diverging. A pause. The mayor's office called Mercer at 6:30. They want a meeting tomorrow morning. No lawyers, just principals. What does that mean, no lawyers? It means they want to have a conversation they can describe as informal so that anything said in it isn't automatically on record. Mercer declined. Good. We're proposing a formal mediation instead, on record, tomorrow at 10. Park paused again. There's one more thing. The IG office wants your full statement, not the summary you gave in the conference room this morning. A full recorded statement. Every detail of the encounter from when you pulled into the station to when you were processed. They want it before the formal investigation goes to the next phase. When? Tomorrow morning, 8 a.m., before the city mediation. That's fine. Natalie. Park's voice shifted register slightly. How are you actually doing? She looked at the empty soup cup in her hand. The locker room mirror had told her one thing. The way her shoulders felt right now told her another. I'm tired, she said. I'm fine, but I'm tired. That's reasonable. You had an extraordinary day. I've had worse days, she said. This one just had more paperwork. Park made a small sound that was somewhere between a laugh and an exhale. Get some sleep. I'll send a car for you at 7:30. The department's official statement came out at 9:15 p.m., and it was a document that had clearly been written by a committee of lawyers who had been told to say something without saying anything. It used the phrase, "We take all allegations seriously," twice. It used the phrase the officer in question throughout, never naming Holt. It characterized the morning's events as a situation involving disputed credentials and a subsequent personnel matter, which was the kind of language that looks like information and contains almost none. By 10 p.m., the statement had been dissected, quoted, and responded to by 17 separate news accounts, 4 of which included the text of Park's statement, side by side, with the department's language, a comparison that was not flattering. 3 city council members had issued individual statements calling for an independent investigation. The police union had issued a statement supporting Holt that used the words due process 4 times and said nothing about the video, the text message, or the DOD involvement. Marcus, the 17-year-old, had given a second interview, this one on camera, to a local TV station, sitting in his living room with his mother visible in the background. And he said, simply and without performance, that he'd filmed it because he knew something wrong was happening and he didn't want it to disappear. He said he was glad the lady was okay. He said he hoped it mattered. The clip of him saying that got more engagement than the original arrest video. Oh, Natalie slept 6 hours, which was more than she'd expected and less than she needed. She was up at 5:45, the same unreasonable internal clock, the same dark room, the same radiator knocking against the baseboard. She made coffee, and this time she drank it, standing at the kitchen window, watching the parking structure where her Jeep had been returned the previous evening, exactly where she'd left it that morning before any of this started. She thought about the morning, not with dread exactly, more with the specific kind of attention she gave to any situation that required precision, the same attention she used when a patient's chart had something that didn't add up, when a procedure had a step that could go wrong if you weren't watching the right thing at the right moment. Tomorrow, today, had several of those steps. Her phone showed a new email at 6:03 a.m. from the Riverside Memorial HR Department. The subject line was Addendum to Personnel File, Incident Correction Notice. She opened it. It was 3 paragraphs, formal, bureaucratic, the kind of language that institutions use when they are correcting something they'd prefer to pretend never happened. It stated that the notation entered into her file on the morning of the previous day regarding an active criminal arrest had been reviewed and was being formally struck from her record pending written confirmation from the Redstone City Police Department. Pending written confirmation. Not struck yet. Pending. She noted that. She forwarded the email to Park without comment. Park responded in 4 minutes. I saw it. We'll address this in the mediation. The confirmation will come today. The IG statement recording started at 8 a.m. and ran for 1 hour and 40 minutes. Verone conducted it in a conference room at a federal building downtown. Not the precinct, not the hospital, neutral ground, with a court reporter and a colleague named Ashby, who ran the audio equipment and said almost nothing. Natalie sat across from Verone and went through the morning chronologically, in the way she'd been trained to report an incident. No editorializing, no emotional context unless asked, specific times and specific words when she had them, and clear flagging when she was estimating. She was asked about the exact words Holt used. She gave them. She was asked about her decision to activate the emergency signal. She explained the protocol, the 2-finger press, the frequency, the response threshold. Verone asked whether she had anticipated being released once the signal was processed. Not immediately, Natalie said. The signal goes to a monitoring contact. It flags that I'm in a situation involving law enforcement. The response time depends on the duty rotation and the receiving officer's assessment of urgency. She paused. I expected it to take longer than it did. How long did it actually take? The first communication came in at 8:47. The signal was activated at approximately 7:32. That's 75 minutes. She said it without inflection, but Verone was watching her face, and there was something there. Not anger exactly, more the careful management of something that could become anger if she let it. Is that fast in your assessment? It's within range. She looked at the table. Faster than I expected, given that I'm on restricted status, and the monitoring contact isn't flagged for immediate response, the way an active deployment signal would be. Meaning someone prioritized your alert. Someone recognized what the ID code meant and made a judgment call. She looked up. I don't know who. I'd like to, eventually. Verone made a note. Is there anything about the encounter that you haven't included in your statement that you think is relevant to the investigation? Natalie thought about that. Not the way people think about it when they're deciding what to hide, but the way they think when they're genuinely checking. One thing, she said. When Officer Reyes brought me to conference room B, the officer who wasn't at the gas station came on at 9. He was the only person in that building who treated me like a person who might be having a bad morning rather than a problem to be managed. I don't know if that matters for the investigation, but it should probably be noted somewhere that not every person in that building behaved the same way. Verone wrote something. It'll be included. The city mediation started 40 minutes late because the department's newly retained outside counsel arrived at 10:38 instead of 10 and spent the first 4 minutes apologizing, which Mercer absorbed without expression, and Park made a small notation about in her legal pad. The room was in a downtown law office, neutral ground again, a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows and the kind of deliberately inoffensive furniture that signals seriousness without personality. Mercer and Park sat on one side of the table. Natalie sat with them, which had been a point of brief negotiation. The city's side had suggested she not be present for the initial session, which Park had declined on her behalf. Across the table were the department's outside counsel, a woman named Farrelly, who had the practiced composure of someone who did this professionally and had stopped finding it upsetting years ago, and a city attorney named Wolfe and Aldrich, the deputy chief of staff, who was wearing a different suit than yesterday and looked like he hadn't slept either. Farrelly opened. The department acknowledges that the events of yesterday morning resulted in a significant harm to Ms. Carter, and that remediation is appropriate. She said it the way you say something when you've been told to say it and you're going to say it correctly and move on. The department is prepared to offer a full written apology, correction of all employment records, and a public statement acknowledging the error. And Captain Holt? Park said. Captain Holt's employment status is subject to a separate process. Captain Holt is under federal investigation for civil rights violations and falsification of records, Park said. His employment status is relevant to the city's position on accountability. Farrelly looked at Wolfe. Wolfe looked at Aldrich. The city is committed to the outcome of the federal investigation, Aldrich said. If that investigation results in findings that necessitate further employment action. We're not talking about further action, Mercer said. It was the first time she'd spoken, and her voice had the specific quality of someone who has been waiting to say something specific and is now saying it. Captain Holt was placed on administrative leave yesterday afternoon. The IG investigation established this morning, and I'm using the word established because the evidence is not in dispute, that Holt directed his public affairs officer to contact Ms. Carter's employer after federal verification of her credentials had already been received. That is not an open question. That is a documented fact. She let it sit for a moment. The city's position that further action must wait for the federal investigation to conclude is not tenable when the department itself possesses the documentation to act now. The room was quiet. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Redstone City was doing what cities do at mid-morning: trucks, foot traffic, the ordinary noise of a place that had not changed overnight regardless of what happened inside specific buildings. Natalie looked at the window for a moment. She thought about Tarver in 412, whether his rate had held through the night. She thought about the soup. "There's something I want to say," she said. 4 faces across the table looked at her. Park glanced sideways but didn't stop her. "I'm not interested in making this department an example," she said. "I understand that the optics of this situation feel existential to a lot of people in this room, and I understand why. But I went to work yesterday. I drove to the gas station because I needed fuel. I showed valid identification to an officer who decided before he looked at it that I couldn't have what I had." She said it in a level voice that had, underneath its evenness, something real. Not anger, but the weight of something that had been true longer than just yesterday. That decision had a chain of consequences that involved my freedom, my employment record, and my time, and nobody in this room is going to be able to give those back. She looked at Aldrich specifically. "What I want is for the city to do what it actually can do. Remove Holt, correct the records, change the verification protocol so the next person this happens to doesn't spend 2 hours in a cell before anyone checks a database." She paused. "That's achievable today. Everything else can follow the process it needs to follow." Aldrich looked at her for a long moment. He had the expression of someone who had come into a room expecting one kind of conversation and was having a different kind, and wasn't sure whether that was better or worse. "The mayor," he said slowly, "is prepared to make a personal public statement, not a prepared release, a personal statement." "When?" Park said. "This afternoon, before 5. Park wrote something. "Suspension of Holt with cause effective today. Full written correction to Riverside Memorial's records, sent directly from the city attorney's office, not the department, today. Public statement from the mayor acknowledging the arrest was wrong. Not an error, not a miscommunication, wrong, before 5 p.m. She looked up. "Those 3 things happened today, and we can discuss the rest of the process on a timeline that works for everyone." Farrelly and Wolf spoke quietly to each other for about 45 seconds. Aldrich had his phone out and was typing something. "Yes," Aldrich said. He put the phone down. "Yes to all 3. The room exhaled. Natalie didn't. She was thinking about something Verone had said that morning in the IG session, not during the formal questioning, but afterward, as the court reporter was packing up and Ashby was coiling cable. Verone had said, offhand, the way people say things that are actually not offhand. The monitoring contact who flagged your signal yesterday, the person who moved it up the priority chain, they're going to want to talk to you. Not as part of the investigation, just personally. She'd said it without elaborating, and Natalie hadn't asked her to, because there were only a handful of people who had access to that monitoring channel, and she thought she knew which one of them had been on duty. She pushed it aside for now. There was still today to get through. Holt's suspension came through in writing at 2:17 p.m. It was not administrative leave. It was suspension with cause, pending investigation, which was a different category with different implications for his pension, his record, and his legal exposure. His union rep issued a statement 40 minutes later that used the word unprecedented and the phrase politically motivated, neither of which landed particularly well given the existence of the text message and the video and the DoD documentation, all of which were now being reported on by 8 separate outlets. Holt himself said nothing publicly. He was, by that point, in a meeting with a criminal defense attorney that had been arranged hastily that morning, and the meeting was going in the direction that meetings with criminal defense attorneys go, when the client has sent a text message that contradicts his stated account, and the contradicting text message is in federal evidence. The mayor's personal statement came at 4:43 p.m., 17 minutes before Park's deadline, which Natalie suspected was a coincidence but didn't particularly believe was one. He stood outside City Hall without a podium, which was a choice, and he said, "What happened yesterday morning was wrong. Not procedurally uncertain, not a matter of competing interpretations. Wrong." A woman drove to a gas station and was arrested because an officer made a determination about who she was before he looked at what she was showing him. That determination was discriminatory, it was incorrect, and this city is responsible for it because it happened at the hands of a city officer. He said it without looking at notes. "I'm sorry. The city is sorry. And we are going to do the work of making sure sorry means something." The statement was 41 seconds long. It was the most direct thing the mayor had said publicly in 4 years, according to the political reporters who immediately wrote that contextual detail into their coverage, and Natalie read about it on her phone in the Riverside Memorial break room between her 3:30 check and her 4:15 chart review. She put her phone away and went back to work. Park called at 6:05 with one more piece of information, delivered in a voice that had something in it Natalie hadn't quite heard before from her, a specific quality of alertness that was different from professional focus. "The IG office sent over their preliminary findings," Park said. "They move fast when they move." What did it say? It establishes the civil rights violation. It establishes the falsification, specifically the call to your employer. And it... She stopped for a half second, which was unlike her. "There's a fourth finding, something I didn't anticipate." "What?" "Holt's record. The IG pulled his full service history as part of standard investigation background. Natalie..." She stopped again. "This is not the first time. There's a prior complaint, 14 months ago. Different woman, different incident, same initial characterization, fraudulent documents, stolen vehicle. That case was closed internally. Never went outside the department." Park's voice was careful, but underneath the care there was something solid and dark. "The woman in that case filed a complaint. It was reviewed by Holt's direct supervisor, and it was marked unfounded." Natalie stood very still. "Who was the supervisor?" A pause. "Braddock," Park said. The word landed in the break room the way things land when they change the shape of everything around them. Natalie stood there with her phone against her ear and the ventilation humming and the distant sound of a cart in the corridor, and she thought about Braddock in the mediation room yesterday. Full cooperation, careful and measured, retaining private counsel to separate himself from the department, separating himself from Holt. But he had been Holt's supervisor 14 months ago. He had reviewed a complaint and closed it. He had put unfounded on a record and moved on. "Natalie," Park said, "I heard you. This changes the scope, significantly." "Yes," she said. "It does." She looked at the wall above the coffee machine, the faded cartoon, the hand hygiene protocol, the birthday card for Justine. The ordinary evidence of a working day. She thought about the woman 14 months ago, whose complaint was marked unfounded and went nowhere, who had probably made a calculation about the cost of pursuing it further and decided the cost was too high, and who had no way of knowing that 14 months later someone else was going to be standing in a break room finding out her story wasn't finished yet. "I want her name," Natalie said. "If she's willing." Park said, "I'll find out." Park found the name by the following morning. Her name was Denise Ower, 38 years old, a licensed electrician who had been driving a company van on a job site call when she was pulled over on Route 9, the same corridor as the Riverside Gas Mart, 14 months ago. She had been told the van's registration looked irregular. She had presented her contractor's license, her employer's insurance documents, and her own driver's license. She had spent 4 hours in a holding room at the 4th Precinct before a supervisor from her employer arrived and confirmed who she was. Her complaint, filed 10 days later, had been reviewed by Commander Braddock and marked unfounded within 3 weeks. She had not pursued it further. She was currently living in the same house she'd been in 14 months ago, 12 minutes from where Natalie worked. Park passed the name and number to Natalie at 7:15 a.m. with a note that said, "She knows who you are. She's been following the coverage. She said she'd take your call." Natalie stood in her kitchen with her coffee and looked at the number for a while. Then she dialed. Denise Ower picked up on the second ring, and for a moment neither of them said anything. The particular silence of two people who have arrived at the same point from different directions and are working out what to say first. "I saw the video," Denise said. "I saw it the morning it went up." "I know." Natalie moved to the window. I'm sorry it took this long for anyone to find the connection. It's not your fault it took this long. Denise's voice was level, but underneath it there was the texture of something that had been sitting still for over a year, and was now, carefully and with great wariness, being allowed to move. I filed the complaint. They told me it was unfounded. I had a mortgage and a kid in middle school, and I didn't have the money or the energy for a legal fight that I didn't think I was going to win. She paused. I still don't know if I was wrong about that. You weren't wrong to make the calculation you made, Natalie said. You were wrong to have to make it. Silence. What happens now? Denise asked. With my case. The IG investigation is formally expanding to include Braddock's oversight role. That means the internal dismissal of your complaint is being reviewed as part of the federal record. Natalie kept her voice even. It means your complaint isn't unfounded anymore. It means somebody is going to have to answer for marking it that way. Another silence, longer this time. When Denise spoke again, her voice had changed in a way that wasn't quite relief. Relief was too clean a word for something this complicated, but was something in the same family. I need to think about whether I want to be involved, she said, publicly. You don't have to decide right now. I know. A breath. But I want to say something to you. She stopped, started again. I sat in that holding room for 4 hours, and I kept thinking. I kept telling myself I had done something wrong, that there must have been something I missed, something I should have said differently, some reason this was happening that made sense. Her voice tightened slightly, controlled. It took me 6 months to stop thinking that. 6 months to believe completely that I had done nothing wrong. Natalie looked out the window at the parking structure. I know, she said. How long did it take you? She thought about the holding cell, the metal bench, the frosted window, the way she had sat down and run her breathing through a protocol she'd learned in a different life, the deliberate act of not letting the room change her assessment of herself. I never believed it, she said. But that's not because I'm stronger than you. It's because I spent 3 years in places where people tried very hard to make me doubt what I knew, and I had to learn not to. She paused. You didn't have that training, and you still filed the complaint. That matters. Denise was quiet for a long moment. Okay, she said finally. Let me talk to my daughter. Then I'll call your lawyer. Well, the IG's formal expansion to include Braddock was made public on the 4th day. It came through a press release from the DoD Inspector General's office, 3 paragraphs, clinical and precise, stating that the scope of the investigation had been broadened to include the oversight conduct of the precinct's commanding officer regarding a prior complaint dismissed in the same period. It named no additional victims. It didn't need to. By the time the release went out, Okafor had already been working her sources for 18 hours, and her piece ran 40 minutes after the official statement with details the release hadn't included, sourced to people the release hadn't named. Denise O'Ware had agreed to be identified. By name, with a photograph, and with a quote that Okafor had clearly spent time on, precise, human, impossible to dismiss. The quote said, I did everything right. I showed my documents. I answered every question, and they put me in a room for 4 hours and told me afterward that nothing happened. Something happened. It just took someone else before anyone would look. The piece ran at 11:47 a.m. By 2 p.m., it had more traffic than anything the Tribune had published in 14 months. Braddock resigned on the morning of the 5th day. He did not make a statement. His attorney made a statement, 1 paragraph, citing personal reasons and a desire to allow the investigation to proceed without institutional distraction. It used the word cooperating twice in ways that were specifically calibrated to suggest voluntary participation rather than compelled testimony, a distinction that was going to matter in the coming months, and that everyone reading it understood perfectly well. The resignation was reported by every outlet that had been covering the story, and most of them noted, in the same breath, that it came 48 hours after the IG expansion and approximately 24 hours after Denise O'Ware's name entered the public record. The sequencing was its own kind of statement. At the 4th Precinct, which was now operating under an interim commander assigned by the city pending a formal restructuring review, the staff was quiet in the specific way of people who are going to work and doing their jobs and not talking about the things that are happening around them because there is nothing useful to say yet. Reyes, the mid-30s officer who had spent 2 days appearing in doorways with information he hadn't asked to carry, was transferred to a different unit as part of the restructuring, a transfer that the interim commander had been careful to describe as logistical rather than punitive, and that Reyes had accepted without comment. The young officer from the gas station, the one who had hesitated before putting on the cuffs, whose face had been caught on both videos doing the thing faces do when a person is choosing between what they know is right and what they've been told to do, was placed on administrative reassignment pending the investigation's conclusion. He had also, in the days following, submitted a written statement to the IG office that had not been requested, describing in precise detail the sequence of events at the gas station, and specifically noting that he had raised a verbal concern about the plate discrepancy before the arrest proceeded, and that the concern had been overridden. That statement had been received. It was in the record now. Nobody from the department publicly mentioned his name. Natalie made a note of it privately and said nothing because there was nothing to say yet, and because some things needed to settle before they could be addressed properly. So, Holt was formally charged on the 7th day. 3 counts. Unlawful detention under color of law, civil rights violation under 42 U.S.C., Section 1983, and falsification of records in a federal proceeding. The charges were filed in federal district court, which meant this was not a local matter that could be quietly resolved through departmental channels or municipal negotiations. It was federal, it was public, and it was documented with the specific thoroughness of an investigation that had been handed records by the department's own systems. He turned himself in at 9 a.m. through his attorney, which meant he walked through a door rather than being walked. That was the only concession the process made to his 26 years. Everything else was the same as it was for everyone else: processed, photographed, printed, released on bond pending arraignment. There was one reporter outside when he came out. She didn't shout a question, she just had the camera running. The photograph that ran in the Tribune the following morning was a single frame from that footage, taken at the moment Holt came through the door and saw the camera and had the specific expression of a man who had spent 26 years on the other side of that moment and was now, for the first time, on this side of it. The photograph needed no caption. The Tribune ran one anyway. Former Captain Douglas Holt, Redstone City Police Department, following federal charges filed Thursday. Okafor had written the story herself, as she'd written every story in this sequence. It was measured and factual and contained no language that couldn't be defended in a court of law, and it was, by a distance, the best work she'd done in 11 years at the paper. Natalie went back to the Riverside Gas Mart on the evening of the 8th day. She hadn't planned it, exactly, or she had, but not in the way of something scheduled. It had just been sitting at the back of her mind since the morning this started, a small, unfinished thing, and on the 8th evening after a shift that ended at 7, she found herself taking exit 9 instead of the interstate, the same way she'd taken it 8 days ago because it was on the route and she needed fuel. The station looked exactly the same. 6 pump islands, the convenience store with the smudged windows, the sign about the breakfast sandwiches. Pump 7 was open. She pulled in. A different cashier was at the register inside. Not the young guy from that morning, someone older, a woman in her 50s who recognized Natalie before Natalie had gotten 3 steps through the door. Her face did several things quickly and then settled on something that was somewhere between relief and the specific awkwardness of a person who knows they are standing in the place where a wrong thing happened. "Ms. Carter," she said. "I just need a water," Natalie said. She went to the refrigerated case in the back. Same case, same position. She picked a bottle from the shelf, the same brand she'd been reaching for 8 days ago when she heard the car pull up outside. She brought it to the register. The woman scanned it with hands that were slightly uncertain, which was the only external sign of what she was managing internally. "It's on us," she said. Natalie looked at her. "You don't have to do that." "I know." The woman met her eyes. "I want to." Natalie let her. She put the bottle in her bag. She was almost to the door when the woman said, "I was here, that morning." Natalie stopped. "I was in the back when it started. By the time I got to the window, he already had the cuffs on." Her voice was tight. "I should have come outside." Natalie looked at her for a moment. There were many true things she could have said to that, and most of them would have been unkind, and several of them would have been fair, and 1 or 2 of them would have been useful. She chose the one that seemed most worth saying. "You're here now," she said. "That's something." She pushed through the door. The evening was cooler than it had been 8 days ago, the specific quality of late-season air that was still warm enough to not need a jacket, but not warm in the way of summer. At Pump 4, a man in a work shirt was fueling a truck and not looking at her. At Pump 6, two teenagers were splitting a bag of chips beside a car that was probably not entirely one of theirs. The ordinary population of a gas station on an ordinary evening. She got back in the Jeep. She opened the water bottle and drank half of it, the way she'd intended to 8 days ago. She put the cap back on. She sat for a moment. The pump island where she'd been arrested was empty. The concrete looked the same as the other pump islands. Pumps did not retain the events that happened near them. She sat there for about 45 seconds, and then she started the car and drove toward the exit, and she did not look back. The formal apology from the city came in two forms. The first was a written letter, signed by the mayor and the city attorney, addressed to Natalie Carter by name, which was sent to Park's office, and which contained language that Park had negotiated over 2 days to ensure it said what it needed to say, rather than what the city's legal team found comfortable. It used the word wrong 4 times. It acknowledged the discriminatory nature of the encounter, the failure of verification protocol, and the deliberate and damaging communication to her employer. It did not use the phrase "we regret if." Park had taken that out in the first revision. The second was public. The mayor stood at a press conference on the 9th day with Natalie to his left and the city attorney to his right, and he said, in front of cameras and reporters, and a room that was full in the way rooms are full when something real is happening, that the city owed Natalie Carter a debt it could not fully repay, and that the best it could do was make the record correct and the system better and mean both of those things in practice rather than in language. He said that Commander Braddock's resignation had been accepted and that the restructuring of the 4th Precinct's oversight protocols was underway under independent review. He said that Denise O'Ware deserved the same acknowledgement, and he said her name. Natalie stood there in the way she stood everywhere, without performance, without the specific brightness people put on when they are in front of cameras, just present and still, and slightly tired in a way that was visible if you were paying attention. A reporter asked her from the floor how she felt. She took a breath. "I feel like I want to go to work tomorrow," she said. "I have patients who need me and a unit to get back to, and things to do that matter. That's what I feel." She paused. "And I feel like the women who were stopped before me and didn't have what I had. Didn't have the signal, didn't have the training, didn't have the documentation. Those women deserve this outcome too, and they didn't get it. So whatever this is, it's not entirely a victory until we figure out how to make the process work for them." Nobody had a follow-up question that seemed adequate to that, so the room moved on, and afterward in the corridor outside, Park touched her arm briefly and said, "That was the right thing to say." "It was the true thing," Natalie said. "I don't always know if those are the same." The DoD oversight review that Natalie had agreed to participate in was held 12 days after the arrest. It was closed, a 3-hour session in a federal building, and she gave the same account she had given Verone. With the additional time, the format allowed for procedural detail. The review board was 6 people. She knew one of them. He was sitting at the far left end of the table when she came in, and he was older than she'd last seen him, which was always how it was with people from that part of her life, that they were always older, and so was she, and the time between couldn't be accounted for in any satisfying way. Colonel Marcus Braith had been the commanding officer of her unit for 18 months of her deployment. He had signed off on a restricted credentialing status. He had been, as far as she could reconstruct it, the person who had moved her emergency signal up the priority chain 8 days ago. She sat down across from the board. She looked at him. He didn't change expression, because this was a formal session and it wasn't the moment for it, but something in the quality of his attention shifted in a way she recognized. The session ran its course. She answered every question with the same precision she'd brought to Verone's session, and the board asked sharp procedural questions that told her they had read everything before she arrived. At the end, the chair thanked her and told her the board's findings would be used to develop standardized law enforcement protocol for encounters involving holders of restricted federal credentials, with the goal of nationwide implementation through the Justice Department's training division. Nationwide. She sat with that word for a moment. Afterward, in the corridor, Braith fell into step beside her. They walked for a few seconds without speaking. "You moved the signal," she said. "I was the duty officer," he said. "I recognized your code." "You didn't have to flag it as priority." "Yes, I did," He said it simply, without elaboration. He was a man who had always communicated most of what mattered without saying the full thing, and she had learned, a long time ago, how to read the part that wasn't said. What wasn't said here was, I know what you are, and I know what that cost, and some things don't stay buried just because you decided to let them. How long have you known where I was? She said. 14 months? She processed that. You didn't say anything. You didn't want me to. He glanced at her. You're allowed to choose what you do with your life, Natalie. I'm not your commanding officer anymore. No, she said. You're not. They walked to the end of the corridor. Through the window at the end, Redstone City was in its midday configuration, ordinary, in motion, indifferent to the specific things happening inside this specific building. The board is going to recommend you for a commendation, he said. Civilian category. For the policy contribution. I don't need a commendation. I know you don't need it. He stopped walking. That's not why they're giving it to you. She looked at him. He had the face of someone who had made difficult decisions in difficult places and carried them without making them anyone else's problem, which was a thing she recognized because she had learned it from people like him, and it had become over time something she carried in her own body. Will you accept it? He said. She thought about Denise O'Ware, sitting in a holding room for 4 hours and spending 6 months afterward doubting herself. She thought about the woman from that second video angle who had come forward with her 15 seconds of footage because it showed something the first clip didn't. She thought about Marcus, 17 years old, filming something that bothered him before school and changing the shape of an investigation because of it. Yes, she said. I'll accept it. Holt's arraignment was on the 14th day. He pleaded not guilty on all 3 counts, which his attorney had advised and which everyone in the federal prosecutor's office had anticipated. The trial date was set for 8 months out. That timeline would compress or expand depending on what the discovery process produced and what the discovery process produced was. At this point, an open question with a fairly predictable answer given what was already in the record. He posted bond and went home. He did not make a statement. His attorney made one, the same paragraph as before, the same language, worn smooth from use. By the afternoon, it had been reported and moved on from, because the story had stopped being primarily about Holt and had become about something larger than him. The system that had let him do what he did and what it was going to take to change that system, and whether the change was going to be the kind that lasted or the kind that lasted until people stopped watching. Natalie read the arraignment coverage on her lunch break and put her phone away and went back to work. Tarver was discharged from Riverside Memorial on the 15th day. His numbers had been stable for 5 days. The inflammation at the incision margin had resolved. Dr. Voss signed the discharge paperwork at 10 a.m., and Natalie was in 412 when the transport aide came with the wheelchair, which Tarver objected to on principle and then accepted because the aide had done this approximately 10,000 times, and his look communicated that very clearly. Natalie went through the discharge instructions with him. The medications, the follow-up schedule, the activity restrictions, the specific signs that meant he needed to call someone immediately rather than wait. She said it all in the clear, unrushed way she said discharge instructions, looking at him rather than at the paperwork, because the paperwork was a backup, and the actual information had to land in a person. He listened with the attention of a man who took things seriously when they mattered, which she had understood about him from the beginning. How long until I'm actually myself again? He asked. 8 weeks minimum. 12 is more realistic. That long. You had a machine put in your heart, she said. Give it time. He looked at her for a moment. He had the look of a person assembling something he'd been thinking about over several days and had finally decided to say. You know what I noticed, he said, in all the coverage. They kept saying you were calm. Every account, every person who was there. She was completely calm. She picked up his chart to return it. People said that. Like it was something extraordinary. He shifted in the wheelchair, resettled. But it's not extraordinary, is it? You've been calm every time you've come in this room. You're calm right now. He looked at her. You were calm because you knew who you were, and that's not a small thing. Most people don't have that. Most people in that situation would have fallen apart, and nobody would have blamed them, but they would have fallen apart. You didn't. She didn't say anything for a moment. Most people haven't had the practice, she said finally. I had unusual practice. Still, he said. The aide looked between them and waited with the patient expression of someone accustomed to waiting. You should go, Natalie said. Your wife is downstairs. She is, he agreed. He reached out and shook her hand. Not the brief formal handshake of a patient thanking a nurse, but the kind of handshake that means something. The grip held a beat longer than necessary. Thank you, he said, for the heart stuff. And the other stuff. She walked him to the elevator. The doors closed. She stood in the corridor for a moment and then went back to work. What? On the 22nd day, the DoD Oversight Board issued an interim protocol recommendation to the Justice Department. 14 pages, specific and procedural, laying out a verification pathway for law enforcement encounters with holders of restricted federal credentials. A step-by-step process with clear timelines, escalation requirements, and accountability checkpoints. It cited, in its preamble, the Redstone City incident as the case that had exposed the gap the protocol was designed to close. It did not name Natalie. Restricted status, still. But the case was named, and the date was named, and anyone paying attention would know. Park called when the protocol was released. Have you seen it? Just now. It's going to justice for comment period, 90 days. If it clears that, it goes to implementation. Park's voice had the specific quality of someone who has been working toward a specific outcome and is watching it arrive. That's a policy change, Natalie. Nationwide protocol. I know. Because of what happened to you at that gas station. Because of what happened to me and Denise and probably other people we don't know about yet. She was at the nurse's station, speaking quietly, one eye on the board. The gas station was just the one that got recorded. Park was quiet for a moment. Are you okay? I've been asked that a lot lately. I know. I'm asking again. Natalie looked at the board. The patient names, the room numbers, the status indicators, the ordinary machinery of a working unit. The place she'd been for 14 months. The place she'd driven toward that morning before the morning went wrong. Yeah, she said. I'm okay. You don't have to be okay, Park said. You're allowed to have had a hard 3 weeks. I know. She picked up a chart. It was hard. And it's also fine. Both things are true. She heard Park smile somehow. There was a quality to the pause that had a smile in it. I'll send you the final documentation when the investigation closes. Probably another 6 to 8 weeks. Okay. And Natalie? Park stopped. It was good work. What you did. All of it. I drove to a gas station, Natalie said. You drove to a gas station and you didn't brake, Park said. You know how many people brake. You know what it looks like when they do. You didn't. And then you helped us build something that's going to outlast all of this. She paused. That's not nothing. Natalie thought about the holding cell, the metal bench, the way she'd run her breathing down to a protocol and waited for the terrain to shift. She thought about what it had cost, in small and unaccountable ways, to do that. Not the dramatic cost, but the quiet one. The way her shoulders had felt that night, the way the granola bar had tasted, the way she'd looked at herself in the locker room mirror and seen exactly what she was. No, she said. It's not nothing. The commendation was awarded on the 31st day, in a room that was not large and not full of cameras, which was the way she had asked for it. Braith presented it. The certificate cited her contribution to federal policy development and her conduct during and following an unlawful detention, and it used words that were formal and correct and did not capture anything essential about what had actually happened, which was fine. Formal documents rarely did. She put it in her bag and drove to work. At Riverside Memorial, the unit had a new patient in 4 and 12, a 53-year-old woman, 2 days post-op from a kidney resection, whose chart had a flag on the pain management protocol that Natalie spotted in the first 5 minutes and flagged for the attending. The attending adjusted the order. The woman slept better that afternoon than she had the 2 nights before, though she didn't know why. That was most of what this work was. Small decisions, invisible from outside, that changed the shape of someone's recovery. No cameras. No record except the chart. Nobody watching except the patient, who was often asleep. She did it the same way she always did it. Not perfectly, not without the occasional error, or the shift that ran long, or the situation she didn't handle with ideal grace. She was human, and the work was hard, and some days were better than others. But she went back the next day, and the day after, and the one after that, because this was the place she had chosen, and the work was real, and it was hers. This is what strength actually looks like most of the time. Not the moment in front of the camera, not the policy document, not the commendation, not the press conference where someone finally says the true thing out loud. Those things matter, but they're the surface. Underneath them is the ordinary person who goes back to work the next morning, who does the job right even when nobody is watching, who absorbs the weight of what was done to them and carries it without letting it define the ceiling of what they can do. People will underestimate you. Sometimes it's because of what you look like, or what you drive, or how you speak, or the title on your badge, or the absence of a title. Sometimes it's because the story they've already written about you is more convenient than the evidence in front of them. And there will be moments when you have to stand very still in a space that is trying to diminish you, and you will have to find in yourself the thing that cannot be taken by a pair of handcuffs or an unfounded report or a phone call to your employer designed to strip you of your credibility before you get the chance to defend it. That thing is yours. It was always yours. No one has the authority to confiscate it. Natalie Carter drove home from her shift on the 31st day. She made coffee she had time to finish. She sat at her kitchen window for a little while, in the quiet, watching the parking structure and the street beyond it, and the city going about its evening business. And then she went to bed. She was up at 4:15. The radiator knocked. The highway truck downshifted 2 blocks over. She got up. She had work to do.